Ever feel like you're stuck in a swamp when it comes to military theory?
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Well, today we're diving into some classic Clausewitz on defense. But, and here's the twist, we're talking about swamps and forests.
Exactly. That's right. We're going deep into excerpts from chapters 20 and 21 of On War.
A book that's been called.
Oh, the strategist's Bible.
Which, I have to say, even though it was written back in the 19th century,
Mm-hmm.
still holds up amazingly well for modern military minds like yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Clausewitz, he wasn't just some, armchair general. He was really trying to get at those timeless principles of warfare.
Right, and that's what makes his work so relevant even today.
Exactly.
So first up, we've got swamps. And I know what you're thinking.
Hmm.
Swamps. Not exactly the first thing that comes to mind when you think about, well, impenetrable defenses.
Right. Not exactly the Great Wall, are they?
Exactly.
Eh.
But Clausewitz, he wasn't talking about those massive Everglades-style swamps. He was more interested in the smaller, more common marshes and lowlands. The kind of terrain that, with the right approach, can actually be turned into a defensive advantage.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting, right? Because at first glance, a swamp, it doesn't exactly scream impenetrable fortress. He even compares them to rivers.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Both can hinder an enemy's movement, but swamps, they're a whole different beast.
It's one thing to throw a bridge over a river,
Right.
but building a causeway across a swamp, that's a massive undertaking,
Absolutely. Time-consuming, resource-intensive.
and it leaves you incredibly vulnerable.
Exactly. And even if you manage to build that causeway, good luck defending it. Clausewitz argues that destroying a bridge, it's quick, it's easy, especially compared to completely negating a causeway. And this leads him to, well, a key concept in his thinking about swamp warfare, and that's the idea of a local and passive defense.
So instead of trying to hold a continuous line, you're concentrating your forces at strategic choke points.
Exactly. Turning that swamp into, almost like a force multiplier. And this is where that whole idea of interior lines comes into play.
Hmm.
The defender in the swamp, they can utilize those shorter internal lines of communication, movement. They can shift reinforcements around, move supplies, all while the attacker's stuck out there, bogged down in that difficult terrain.
Okay, so I see the tactical advantages here, but this all sounds very well passive.
Right.
What's stopping the enemy from simply, I don't know, going around or just waiting you out?
That's the thing about passive defense, isn't it? It
Yeah.
can be a bit of a double-edged sword.
And Clausewitz, he acknowledges that, right? The limitations of a purely passive defense.
He does. He makes it very clear that just relying on the terrain, no matter how difficult it might be, that's not enough. Because if the enemy, they find an unguarded path, or if the defender just sits there, completely inactive, even the most treacherous swamp can be bypassed.
So it's not enough to just hunker down and hope for the best.
Exactly. You got to be proactive, even in defense. He stresses the importance of coupling a strong defensive position with well-timed offensive action.
Keeping them off balance.
Exactly. It's about disrupting their tempo, keeping them guessing, and then when the opportunity arises, bam, you hit them with everything you've got.
So it's about finding that balance, right,
Yeah.
between leveraging the terrain's defensive advantages and maintaining the flexibility to act decisively when the opportunity arises.
Exactly. And what's a great example of this?
Oh, I'm all ears. Give me a good historical example.
The Dutch waterline.
Okay, yeah. I was just thinking about that. The Dutch, they were famous for their, strategic use of water, weren't they? But how did that actually play out on the battlefield?
So picture this, okay. It's the 17th century. The Dutch are facing off against the might of the French army.
No small feat.
No! And they decide, you know what? We're going to use this network of fortifications, inundations, intentional flooding
Oh, wow.
to create a defensive barrier.
And that's the Dutch water line in action.
Exactly.
And it worked.
In 1672, they managed to hold off a much larger French force. We're talking legendary commanders like Condé and Luxembourg.
Wow.
And this was a testament to the strength of a well-planned, unified defense. They used that terrain to their advantage.
Okay, so that's an example of it working really well.
Hmm.
But I imagine there were times when it didn't work out so well.
There were. Fast forward to 1787, the waterline faces a new test. The Prussians.
Led by.
The Duke of Brunswick.
And I'm guessing things didn't go so well for the Dutch this time around.
You're right, they didn't. Despite the waterline, and its inherent strength. The Prussians, they broke through.
So what changed?
Well, for one, the Dutch were dealing with a lot of internal conflicts, divided command. There was a real lack of coordination. It wasn't just about the terrain anymore. It was about leadership, strategy.
And that all-important element of unity.
Absolutely. And this just goes to show, something Clausewitz emphasizes throughout On War, and that's that terrain alone.
Doesn't win wars.
Exactly.
It's about understanding the nuances of that terrain.
Right.
Coupling that with sound strategy, decisive leadership, and then being willing to adapt when the situation demands it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's not about, sticking to rigid doctrines. It's about understanding the principles behind those doctrines.
And then applying them.
Yes.
To the specific challenges you're facing.
Exactly. But let's move on from the soggy lowlands.
Yeah, let's dry off a bit.
And venture into a different kind of terrain, forests.
All right, lead the way. I'm ready to trade in my waders for, some sturdy boots. What does Clausewitz have to say about fighting in the woods?
So you might think, based on like every war movie ever, that forests are like the defender's best friend.
Right. Lots of cover, concealment,
Sexy.
ambush opportunities. It seems like a no-brainer.
Right, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But Clausewitz, he throws a bit of a curveball here. He says that if a forest is open, if it's got a lot of roads running through it, it's actually not ideal for direct defense.
Really?
Yeah.
That's kind of counterintuitive. I would have thought, dense trees, limited visibility,
Yeah.
plenty of places to hide. That sounds like a defensive advantage to me.
Yeah.
So what's the reasoning there? What's Clausewitz's take on that?
Well, he argues that in those kinds of forests, it's actually the attacker who benefits more from the terrain.
Interesting.
Yeah, because defenders, they need what? They need clear sight lines. Right.
To observe enemy movements.
Exactly. Coordinate their defense. And forests, especially those ones with clearings and roads, they can make it very difficult to maintain those sight lines.
So instead of a wide open battlefield where you can see the enemy coming from a mile away,
Right.
you're dealing with this, chaotic maze of trees and undergrowth. It's harder to track their movements. It's harder to coordinate your own forces. And much easier, I imagine, for an attacker to launch some kind of surprise attack.
Exactly. You're fighting the terrain as much as you're fighting the enemy. Now, that doesn't mean all forests are off the table. Clausewitz, he says that dense, impassable forests, now those can be incredibly valuable for what he calls indirect defense.
Indirect defense. Okay, so walk me through this.
Okay, so think about how you might use, say, mountainous terrain. Right.
Okay, I'm with you.
You're not trying to hold the entire mountain range, right?
Right, you're using the passes, the choke points.
Exactly. You're using it to channel the enemy into a very carefully prepared killing zone.
So you're using the terrain to funnel the enemy into a position where you can strike from a superior position, a position of advantage.
Exactly. And that's the essence of indirect defense. You're not just reacting to the enemy's movements, you're shaping the battlefield to your advantage, forcing them to move in ways that make them vulnerable.
So kind of like luring them in with the promise of easy passage.
Right.
Only to spring a trap when they least expect it. That's a classic tactic, even today.
Absolutely. And Clausewitz, he points out some key differences between, say, using a river for defense and using a dense forest for this kind of indirect defense.
Okay, I'm interested.
So let's say your initial counterattack, right? Your ambush. It doesn't go as planned.
Okay.
With a river, you can usually, retreat back across to your side, regroup, reassess.
Right, you've got that natural barrier.
Exactly. Forests, not so much.
Yeah, fewer escape routes, much higher stakes. If you're going to use a forest for that kind of defense, you better make sure that your initial attack counts.
You've got to get it right the first time. And that's why he really emphasizes the concentration of forces here. He cautions against spreading your defenses too thin in a forest.
Makes sense. You don't want to leave yourself vulnerable.
Exactly. Because even small enemy detachments, if they can exploit a gap in your lines, they can wreak havoc.
Disrupt the entire operation.
Exactly. And that's the thing about terrain, right? It can work against you as easily as it can work for you.
That's a really good point.
Yes.
It's not a guaranteed win just because you're in the woods. You have to be smart about it.
Exactly. But speaking of being smart about it, there's another aspect of forest warfare that Clausewitz touches on that I think is particularly relevant to modern military thinking.
Okay, lay it on me.
Irregular warfare.
Guerrilla tactic.
Exactly. And it seems like a no-brainer, right? Forests, they seem tailor-made for that kind of warfare.
Right. I mean, you think about historical examples. I mean, the Roman legions getting ambushed in the Teutoburg forest.
The ultimate ambush.
Right. Or even more recently, you think about the jungles of Vietnam.
Exactly, and Clausewitz, he understood this inherently. He knew that forests, they were ideal for raising and deploying irregular forces.
Right, they provide that cover, that concealment.
And it makes it incredibly difficult for a conventionally equipped and organized force to effectively counter them.
It's that whole thing of, you can't defeat what you can't catch. You can't target what you can't see.
Exactly. And the thing about irregular warfare, it's not just about using the forest for cover. It's about understanding how it can shape the enemy's movements, disrupt their supply lines. Really, it can take a toll on their morale.
Right, because it's that constant fear of the unknown. You don't know where the enemy is. You don't know when they're going to strike. It can be very, very unnerving.
Absolutely. And Clausewitz understood that psychological dimension of warfare as well.
So even if you never fire a shot,
Yeah.
right, just by forcing the enemy to operate on your terms,
Right.
in terrain that favors your tactics, your strategy,
It's a victory in itself.
right, it's about dictating the terms of the engagement even before the first shot is fired.
Yeah.
So we've gone from the swamps to the forests, and, we've even touched on how some of these principles apply to, well, more modern forms of conflict. It's pretty amazing to me how these ideas that Clausewitz was writing about, centuries ago, they can still resonate, I think, with the challenges of warfare, even in the 21st century.
It really is. And I think it speaks to his real genius, which was his ability to focus on those enduring principles of warfare,
Right.
the things that transcend the technology, the specific weapon systems, those sorts of things.
Because those change, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen that throughout history.
All the time, constantly evolving, but the human element, that psychological and strategic dimension of conflict, that remains remarkably constant.
And that, I think, is a really powerful insight for anyone in the military today. It's not just about mastering the latest weapon systems or technologies, right? It's about developing that strategic mindset, that ability to adapt, to think critically in the face of, well, threats that are also constantly evolving and changing.
Exactly. And that's why I think, reading Clausewitz and really engaging with military theory more broadly, it's so valuable, even for those, who are out there on the front lines.
Right, because it's like you're sharpening your mind, right?
That's exactly.
You're expanding your toolkit.
You're giving yourself more options,
Exactly. So that when you are faced with, some kind of challenging situation, you're not just stuck with one way of thinking about it, one way of responding.
Yeah.
You've got options.
You've got a plan A, B, C, and D.
Right. And that's valuable in any profession,
Yeah.
right? But especially, I would argue, in the military.
For sure. Absolutely. And so, if there's one big takeaway, I think, from our little deep dive here into Clausewitz on swamps and forests,
It's that terrain matters.
terrain matters.
Right, whether it's a physical landscape, whether it's, something more metaphorical like the digital landscape, right?
Yeah.
Understanding that terrain, understanding how to, to exploit its advantages, but also to mitigate its disadvantages. That's essential, I think, for success on the modern battlefield.
And it's not just about, how you interact with the terrain. It's about understanding how that terrain, how it can influence your enemy's thinking,
Oh, absolutely.
how it can shape their decisions, their actions.
That's really getting into that psychological dimension of warfare that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
About being one step ahead, right? Anticipating your opponent's moves and then using the terrain, using those insights into their thinking to your advantage.
It all comes back to that strategic mindset.
So to kind of channel our inner Clausewitz here for a moment, don't just see the terrain.
Understand it.
Don't just react to it.
Use it.
There you go. I think that's a pretty good note to end on, don't you think?
I think so.
Well, that's our deep dive into Clausewitz's take on swamps and forests. We hope you found this insightful, interesting, maybe even a little bit thought-provoking. Whether you're out there, navigating a dense jungle, whether you're navigating a sprawling city, or even just, the complex landscape of the digital world that we live in today, these principles that Clausewitz outlined centuries ago, they're still as relevant as ever. It's up to us to, to apply them wisely to the challenges that we face. Until next time, keep those strategic minds sharp.